The Day of the Dead, or Dia de los Muertos, is one of Mexico's most iconic traditions, a celebration of life and death that spans centuries. During this time, the veil between the living and the dead is believed to thin, allowing spirits to return and visit their loved ones. Altars are built, candles lit, and marigolds, known as cempasúchil, are laid in vibrant displays to guide the spirits back. But for many, this is more than a time of remembrance. It is a time of mystery when the past echoes through the streets and the spirits of the dead walk among the living. In this article, we explore 4 haunting tales from the heart of Mexico, each intertwined with the Day of the Dead. These stories reflect the eerie beauty and the chilling power of a celebration that embraces both life and death. From ancient cemeteries to isolated villages, these tales will leave you questioning the fine line between the living and the dead. Story 1. The Wandering Soul of Xochimilco. The floating gardens of Xochimilco are world-renowned, celebrated for their vibrant colors and festive atmosphere. Families and tourists alike come to ride the trajineras, gondola-like boats that drift along the ancient canals. But while most come for joy and celebration, the locals tell of something much darker beneath the surface. During the Day of the Dead, when the boundaries between the living and the dead blur, a ghostly figure is said to roam the waterways, a mujer de blanco, woman in white, forever seeking something lost. This haunting tale has been passed down through generations of gondoliers. Diego, who has guided visitors through the canals for over 30 years, tells the tale of the wandering soul as if he were there to witness it firsthand. His voice drops to a whisper when he recounts his own eerie encounter, urging anyone listening to avoid the canals after dark, especially during Dia de los Muertos. The canals of Xochimilco are a living reminder of Mexico's ancient history, having been constructed by the Aztecs centuries ago. The water here runs deep, and the dense vegetation along the banks hides much of the scenery from view. The air is often thick with humidity, and the scent of marigolds, left as offerings for the dead, lingers everywhere. During the day, the canals are filled with laughter, music, and the vibrant colors of life. But as dusk falls, the mood changes, the festive atmosphere fades, and the shadows along the water grow longer. A mist often rises from the water at night, curling around the boats and clinging to the vegetation, transforming the canal into a labyrinth of eerie silence and ghostly reflections. It is in this strange twilight world that the wandering soul is said to appear. Diego's story begins with his grandfather, a respected gondolier, who had witnessed the tragedy that gave rise to the legend. The story goes that a young woman named Isabel, once a local beauty, had fallen in love with a man named Javier. They were to be married, but the night before their wedding, Javier disappeared. The townspeople searched for him for days, but his body was never found. Devastated by grief, Isabel refused to believe he had died. She convinced herself that Javier had been taken by the spirits of the water, who sometimes claimed the souls of the living as payment for passage to the afterlife. Every year, on the Day of the Dead, Isabel would row a small boat along the canals, placing candles and offerings into the water, hoping to guide Javier's spirit back to her. For years, she kept the vigil, her hope turning into madness. Eventually, Isabel herself vanished, and her body was found floating among the reeds, her face pale and her eyes wide open, as if she had seen something terrifying in her final moments. From that day on, locals reported seeing a ghostly woman in a small boat, drifting silently through the canals during the night. She was always dressed in white, her face hidden beneath a veil. She never spoke, but those who saw her said they could hear her softly calling Javier's name. Her voice, barely more than a whisper, carried on the wind. Diego was a young man when he first encountered the wandering soul. It was during the Day of the Dead, a night when the canals were alive with celebration. He had been hired to guide a group of tourists through the canals, but as the night wore on, the revelry began to fade. By midnight, the mist had rolled in, and Diego found himself alone on the water, his passengers having long since gone home. As he navigated the narrow waterways, Diego heard the unmistakable sound of soft crying coming from the distance. At first, he thought it was one of the locals, perhaps a woman mourning the loss of a loved one, but as he drew closer, he saw her, a woman in a small, old-fashioned boat drifting silently in the water. She was dressed in white, her long dark hair flowing down her back, and her face was hidden beneath a lace veil. Diego called out to her, asking if she needed help, but the woman did not respond. Instead, she slowly turned her head toward him, revealing the shadowed outline of her face beneath the veil. The sight sent a chill down Diego's spine, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. His heart pounded as the woman raised her hand, pointing toward the reeds. Without thinking, Diego turned his boat and paddled away as fast as he could, not stopping until he was far from the mist and the eerie silence of the canals. When he finally looked back, the woman was gone, as if she had never been there. But the sound of her soft crying lingered in the air, and Diego swore he could still hear her voice calling Javier's name. Diego's experience left him shaken, and he has since refused to work the canals after dark, especially during the Day of the Dead. He believes the woman in white is still searching for her lost love, and that anyone who gets too close may be pulled into the water, joining her in her endless search. Even now, Diego warns those who venture onto the water at night to stay close to the shore and to never follow the sound of crying. The canals are full of spirits during Dia de los Muertos, he says, his voice low. Some of them are friendly, but others, like the woman in white, are trapped in their sorrow. They are not to be disturbed. The Wandering Soul of Xochimilco is more than just a ghost story. It reflects the deep connection between love, loss, and the spiritual world that is central to Mexican culture. The canals, once used by the Aztecs for agriculture and transportation, have long been associated with the dead, and the woman in white represents the souls of those who cannot move on. The story also highlights the belief that during the Day of the Dead, the veil between the living and the dead is thin, allowing spirits like Isabel to return to the world of the living in search of what they have lost. Story 2: The Ghosts of Guanajuato. The picturesque city of Guanajuato is known for its colorful colonial architecture and narrow alleyways that twist through the hills. But beneath the beauty of the city lies a darker history, centered around its famous Panteón de Santa Paula cemetery. The cemetery is home to one of Mexico's most unsettling sights, the naturally mummified bodies of hundreds of former residents preserved by the dry air and unique soil composition of the region. The mummies, displayed in glass cases, attract tourists from all over the world, but for the locals, they are a reminder that the dead do not always rest peacefully. Rosa, the caretaker of the cemetery, has spent decades tending to the graves and looking after the mummies. Over the years, she has witnessed strange occurrences that defy explanation, ghostly apparitions, eerie sounds, and the unnerving feeling that the dead are watching. But it was during the Day of the Dead 5 years ago that she had her most terrifying experience. The Panteón de Santa Paula is a place where death feels disturbingly close. The cemetery is filled with old, weathered tombstones, many of them dating back to the 19th century. The mummies, their faces contorted in expressions of fear or surprise, are displayed in the museum adjacent to the cemetery, their bodies preserved by the dry, arid climate of Guanajuato. Walking through the cemetery, especially at night, is an eerie experience. The air feels heavy, and the silence is so complete that even the faintest sound can make your heart race. During the Day of the Dead, the cemetery comes alive with color and light, as families decorate the graves with marigolds, candles, and offerings for their loved ones. But not all the spirits that return during this time are peaceful. Rosa had been working at the cemetery for over 20 years, but nothing could have prepared her for what she experienced during the Dia de los Muertos celebrations 5 years ago. As she and her team prepared the graves, setting up altars and decorating the tombstones with marigolds, she noticed a figure standing near the mummy's museum. He was a tall man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his eyes hollow and his skin stretched tight over his bones. At first, Rosa thought he was a visitor who had wandered away from the main path, but something about him felt wrong. The man didn't move, and when Rosa called out to him, he slowly turned his head toward her. His eyes were empty, as if they had been drained of life, and his skin looked like it had been dried out, just like the mummies on display. Rosa felt a chill run down her spine as the man began walking toward her, his feet gliding above the ground. Panicking, Rosa ran back toward the main entrance of the cemetery, but when she turned around, the man was gone. She convinced herself that it had been a trick of the light, or perhaps her mind playing tricks on her after a long day of work. But later that night, as she locked up the cemetery gates, she heard a strange sound, like the shuffling of feet behind her. Rosa turned to find herself face to face with the same man she had seen earlier. This time, he was closer, his empty eyes fixed on her. She could see now that his skin was peeling away in places, revealing the bone underneath. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, and as Rosa backed away in terror, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The man wasn't walking. His feet weren't touching the ground. Rosa fled, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop running until she reached her house, where she locked the doors and windows and refused to come out until the sun rose the next morning. In the days following the Day of the Dead, strange occurrences began happening at the cemetery. Rosa's colleagues reported hearing whispers and footsteps when no one was around, and several of them saw shadowy figures moving among the graves. One night, as Rosa was closing the cemetery gates, she heard the sound of someone crying softly near the Mummies Museum. She knew better than to investigate, but the sound continued for several minutes before fading away. On another occasion, a group of tourists visiting the cemetery during Dia de los Muertos claimed to have seen one of the mummies moving inside its glass case. They described the figure as slowly sitting up, its hands pressing against the glass as if trying to escape. The tourists fled in terror, and though Rosa tried to reassure them that the mummies could not move, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Rosa now believes that the spirits of the dead, particularly the mummies, are restless during the Day of the Dead. The altars and offerings left by families may not be enough to appease them, and some of the spirits seem to be searching for something or someone among the living. Rosa's encounters with the ghostly man and the strange phenomena at the cemetery have left her deeply shaken. She continues to work at the Panteón de Santa Paula, but she refuses to be there after dark, especially during Dia de los Muertos. The dead deserve respect, she says, but some of them are not at peace, and when they come back during the Day of the Dead, they bring their unfinished business with them. Rosa now believes that the mummies themselves may be haunted, their spirits trapped in their preserved bodies, unable to move on to the afterlife. She often wonders if the ghostly man she saw was one of the mummies, his soul searching for rest but unable to find it. The mummies of Guanajuato are a unique and eerie part of Mexico's history. The bodies, preserved naturally by the dry climate, serve as a reminder of the fragility of life and the mysterious nature of death. But the ghostly apparitions and strange occurrences at the Panteón de Santa Paula suggest that not all the dead are at rest. The ghosts of Guanajuato highlight the deep connection between the living and the dead in Mexican culture, especially during the Day of the Dead, when the spirits of the deceased are believed to return to the world of the living. The cemetery, once a place of mourning, has become a place of mystery and fear, where the line between life and death is thin, and the souls of the dead may still walk among the living. Story 3. La Llorona of Lake Texcoco. La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, is one of Mexico's most famous and tragic ghost stories. Her legend is told across the country, with each region adding its own unique twist to the tale. But near Lake Texcoco, where the ancient Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan once stood, her presence is said to be particularly strong. Locals believe that during the Day of the Dead, La Llorona's cries can be heard echoing across the water as she searches for the souls of her drowned children. Carlos, a fisherman who lives near the lake, has heard La Llorona's cries more than once. He has spent his life working on the water, and while he has always respected the legends, he never believed them until the night he came face to face with the Weeping Woman herself. Lake Texcoco is a place steeped in history and legend. Once the heart of the great Aztec capital, much of the lake has been drained, but the marshes and waterways that remain are still eerily beautiful. The water is calm, the reeds whispering in the wind, and at night, the sky is often clear, revealing the stars above. But when the mist rolls in and the wind howls through the trees, the lake takes on an eerie, otherworldly quality, and it is said that La Llorona walks the shores, her cries filling the night. Carlos had always been a practical man. He had heard the stories of La Llorona as a child, how she had drowned her children in a fit of madness and now wandered the earth, weeping for their lost souls, but he had never given them much thought. He was more concerned with catching fish and providing for his family than with ghost stories. But that all changed one fateful night during Dia de los Muertos. Carlos had been out on the lake late into the evening, his small boat bobbing gently on the water as he cast his nets. The air was cool, and a thick mist had settled over the lake, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of him. As he worked, he heard the faint sound of crying in the distance. At first, he thought it was the wind, but as the sound grew louder, more desperate, he realized it was the cry of a woman, a deep, mournful wail that sent a chill down his spine. Carlos looked around, but there was no one else on the lake. The mist was too thick, and the only light came from the small lantern he had brought with him. As the cries grew louder, Carlos felt an overwhelming sense of dread. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned his boat toward the shore, hoping to escape whatever was out there. But before he could move, he saw her, a woman, dressed in white, standing on the edge of the water, her long black hair blowing in the wind. La Llorona. Carlos froze, his breath catching in his throat as the woman turned toward him. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, and as she stared at him, her lips parted in a mournful wail that seemed to pierce the air. For what felt like an eternity, Carlos and La Llorona stared at each other across the water. Her eyes were filled with sorrow and pain, and Carlos felt as if she were looking into his soul, searching for something, perhaps her lost children. He wanted to turn away, to flee, but he was paralyzed by fear, unable to move or even breathe. And then, without warning, La Llorona began to walk toward the water. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and as she stepped into the lake, the water rippled around her feet but did not touch her dress. She continued walking until she was standing in the middle of the lake, her eyes still fixed on Carlos. Suddenly, the crying stopped, and the air grew deathly silent. Carlos's heart pounded in his chest as he watched La Llorona raise her arms, her hands outstretched as if reaching for something just out of reach. For a moment, he thought she was reaching for him, and he felt a cold wave of terror wash over him. But then, as quickly as she had appeared, La Llorona vanished, leaving behind only the mist and the silence of the lake. Carlos rowed back to shore as fast as he could, his hands trembling as he clutched the oars. When he finally reached his house, he locked the doors and windows, refusing to step outside until the sun rose the next morning. Since that night, Carlos has heard La Llorona's cries many times, always during the Day of the Dead, always when the mist rolls in and the air grows cold. He no longer fishes at night, and he warns others to stay away from the lake during Dia de los Muertos. La Llorona is real, he says. She walks the shores of the lake, searching for her children, and if you hear her cries, you must run. Carlos's encounter with La Llorona has left him deeply shaken. He now believes that the weeping woman is not just a legend, but a real spirit, trapped in her endless search for the souls of her drowned children. He fears that anyone who hears her cries may be drawn into her sorrow, just as he was, and he warns others to be careful when walking near the lake at night. Her pain is so great, he says, that it can pull you in, and once you've seen her, you'll never forget. La Llorona is one of Mexico's most enduring and tragic legends. Her story is a reflection of the deep cultural connection between motherhood, loss, and the spiritual world. The weeping woman represents the grief of all mothers who have lost their children, and her endless search for their souls is a reminder that the pain of loss can transcend even death. For those who live near Lake Texcoco, La Llorona's presence is a reminder of the ancient history of the area, once home to the great Aztec Empire. The lake, with its misty shores and ancient ruins, is a place where the past and the present collide, and where the spirits of the dead still walk among the living. Story 4. The Phantom Army of San Juan de Ulua. San Juan de Ulua is a massive fortress that sits on the coast of Veracruz, Mexico. Built by the Spanish in the 16th century, the fortress has served many purposes over the centuries, from a military stronghold to a prison. It is a place steeped in history where the blood of soldiers, prisoners, and revolutionaries has been spilled on its stone floors. But during the Day of the Dead, locals say that the fortress is home to something far more unsettling, a phantom army that rises from the mists, reliving the battles fought on its grounds. This story comes from a retired soldier named Alejandro, who once worked as a guard at San Juan de Ulua. He recalls a terrifying night when the past seemed to come alive, and the sounds of battle echoed through the fortress's ancient halls. San Juan de Ulua is a place that feels frozen in time. The massive stone walls of the fortress rise above the harbor, and the salt air carries with it the scent of the sea and the distant memories of battles fought long ago. The fortress has seen centuries of conflict, from pirate raids to revolutions, and its walls are said to be haunted by the spirits of those who died defending it. During the Day of the Dead, the fortress is often empty, save for a few caretakers and guards. The corridors are dark, the air thick with the scent of incense and candles left as offerings for the dead. It is in this eerie silence that the Phantom Army is said to appear, rising from the shadows to relive the battles that once shook the fortress. Alejandro had been working as a guard at San Juan de Ulua for several years, but he had never experienced anything out of the ordinary until one fateful night during Dia de los Muertos. He had been assigned to patrol the fortress's outer walls, a quiet and uneventful duty that allowed him to take in the beauty of the night sky and the calm waters of the harbor. But as midnight approached, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, and a thick mist rolled in from the sea, enveloping the fortress in a blanket of fog. Alejandro felt a strange sense of unease, as if something was watching him from the shadows. He continued his patrol, his hand resting on his sidearm, but the feeling of dread only grew stronger. And then he heard it, the distant sound of drums, followed by the rhythmic stomp of marching boots. At first, Alejandro thought it was just his imagination, but the sounds grew louder, more distinct, until he could hear the clash of swords and the crack of musket fire. The fortress, which had been deathly silent just moments before, was now filled with the sounds of battle. Alejandro hurried to the nearest lookout point, expecting to see an intruder or some kind of reenactment, but when he looked out over the walls, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the mist below, he could see the shadowy figures of soldiers, their uniforms tattered and blood-stained, marching in formation toward the fortress. Their muskets were raised, their swords drawn, and as they moved closer, Alejandro realized that they were not living men, they were ghosts. For a moment, Alejandro stood frozen, watching in disbelief as the Phantom Army approached the fortress. The soldiers moved in perfect unison, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes hollow and devoid of life. As they marched, the sounds of battle grew louder. The roar of cannons, the shouts of commands, and the cries of wounded men filled the air, echoing off the stone walls of the fortress. Alejandro's heart raced as he realized that the Phantom Army was reenacting a battle that had taken place centuries ago, when the fortress had been attacked by pirates. The soldiers were reliving their final moments, their spirits trapped in an endless loop of violence and death. As the army reached the outer walls of the fortress, Alejandro saw something even more terrifying. Among the ghostly soldiers were the figures of pirates, their faces twisted in rage as they stormed the gates. The two forces clashed in a silent battle, their swords flashing in the moonlight, but no sound came from their weapons. The only sounds Alejandro could hear were the cries of the dying and the distant echo of cannon fire. Alejandro fled the lookout, his heart pounding in his chest as he ran through the dark corridors of the fortress. He could still hear the sounds of battle behind him, the clash of steel, the shouts of soldiers, but when he reached the main courtyard, the noise abruptly stopped. The air was silent once again, and the mist had begun to lift, revealing the empty harbor below. For days after the encounter, Alejandro was plagued by nightmares of the Phantom Army. He would wake in a cold sweat, his mind filled with images of the ghostly soldiers marching toward the fortress, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. He could still hear the distant sound of drums and the crack of musket fire, even when he was awake. Alejandro eventually left his job at San Juan de Ulua, unable to shake the feeling that the fortress was haunted by the spirits of the past. He now believes that the Phantom Army appears every year during Dia de los Muertos, reliving the battles fought on the fortress's grounds, their souls trapped in an endless cycle of violence. Alejandro's encounter with the Phantom Army has left him deeply disturbed. He often wonders if the spirits of the soldiers and pirates are still fighting their battles, unable to find peace in the afterlife. He believes that the fortress, with its long history of bloodshed, is a place where the dead are drawn back to the world of the living, especially during the Day of the Dead. The battles never ended for them, he says. Their spirits are still fighting, trapped in the past, unable to move on. And every year, during Dia de los Muertos, they return to relive the nightmare. San Juan de Ulua is a place where history and legend collide. The fortress has stood for centuries, witnessing countless battles, invasions, and uprisings. The Phantom Army is a reflection of the deep trauma that still lingers over the fortress, a reminder of the lives lost in the many conflicts that took place on its grounds. For the people of Veracruz, the Phantom Army is a symbol of the violence and suffering that has shaped the region's history. The spirits of the soldiers and pirates are a reminder that the past is never truly gone and that the dead may still walk among the living, especially during the Day of the Dead, when the veil between the worlds is at its thinnest. The Day of the Dead is a time of remembrance and celebration, a time when families gather to honor the memories of their loved ones and welcome the spirits of the dead back to the world of the living. But for some, this time of year is also a time of mystery, when the past comes alive and the spirits of the dead walk among the living in ways that are both beautiful and terrifying. The wandering soul of Xochimilco, the ghosts of Guanajuato, La Llorona of Lake Texcoco, and the Phantom Army of San Juan de Ulua are just a few of the many haunting tales that have emerged from Mexico's rich cultural history. These stories remind us that the line between life and death is thin, and that the spirits of the dead may still have unfinished business in the world of the living. As you reflect on these stories, consider the deeper meaning of the Day of the Dead. It is not just a time to mourn the dead, but a time to celebrate their lives and remember the impact they had on the world. And perhaps, in doing so, we can help the spirits of the past find the peace they seek.